Truth matters. And let's see if we can get to the truth today in a debate on the Unbelievable channel between political commentator Ben Shapiro and atheist activist Alex O'Connor. And so this was an interesting debate. It was just a couple days ago. They discussed a lot of topics like free will. I'm not going to start at the free will portion, but we will review a portion of the debate. I'm not going to start at the free will part because I'll just tell you what Alex's position is. He believes that if we have free will, and that we're not predetermined, and that we're not just a bunch of cosmic splots, lucky cosmic beneficiaries on a planet in the middle of nowhere in the universe. If we have free will, then there must be God. So he believes we don't have any free will, even though he freely made the decision to debate Ben Shapiro. So it was a good debate. They were very friendly with each other. I thought it was very cordial. I'm going to talk about a few of the topics and strategies that were used by both sides. And so let's go ahead and start the review and let's see what you think.
Alex, we started with Ben in the first section. Let's start with you. What for you makes an outcome good or bad? And feel free to break that down, define things as you want. And how do we determine what is good and acceptable in society?
Before he starts, I want to say his choice of the word outcome is unfortunate here. It's better if he would have said what makes an action good or bad rather than an outcome, because a lot of atheists and other people who are ethicists focus on utilitarianism and they look at ethical frameworks to determine whether or not actions are good or bad. And the problem that the atheist has, which I think Alex is going to recognize here, is that if you don't have a source or a grounding for any objective moral prescriptions, which is meaning to say moral obligations, the obligations to do what's right and what's wrong, and not what's wrong. We have that moral obligation. If you don't believe that there's any source of that there's a source that's transcendent to us, or God, a source that goes outside of a generation, an era, the people group, all that kind of stuff. If you don't believe that there is any objective moral standard for our morality, for our conscience, the way our conscience calls on us to do what's right, which means what's just, what's fair, what's kind, what's loving. If you don't believe we have a source of that, and there's not a divine moral lawgiver, then society can do whatever it wants. And Alex does recognize this. So let's hear what he has to say.
Here is where I may disappoint you and potentially excite Mrs. Shapiro in that I don't have a good answer to that question. Okay. In that, obviously, attempts have been made for a long time to ground God, to ground good outside of God. I must say that similarly to rehash the same theme, I think there are issues with grounding good in God as well. I don't think that removes the problem. I don't quite know what good is, if it indeed exists. I'm quite suspicious of the concept. I think it might be another one of these unfortunately quite nihilistic evolutionary sort of illusions of a sort. I guess I ascribe to emotivism more than anything, which has sort of gone out of fashion in the past decade. But
so he's subscribing to the idea that our emotions are able to shape our beliefs in what's good and what's bad. It's based on our emotions. Again, that's problematic because we all have emotions, but many of the emotions that you might have might be contrary to what they should be. For example, Hitler probably drew some sort of excitement, some emotions when he knew that he would be murdering 6 million Jews. So you have obviously very flawed emotions. So having grounding in emotions can be very damaging to the earth, particularly since some people are just plain evil.
But I think still has some truth to it in a sense. It's more of a philosophy of language than it is a philosophy of what good and bad actually is. What I do know, however, is that there are problems, I think, with trying to ground morality in the existence of a God, especially if it's done so on the grounds that it essentially can't be done anywhere else. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the religions of the world are false. I think that they are incorrect. That is, I don't think there really is a supernatural authority. And
what was really interesting about this particular statement, as far as what Ben responded earlier in the debate, is Ben said he's noticed that there's a lot of theists who question their beliefs periodically. They may say, I'm not really sure. I don't really know whether or not there's a God. Sometimes they have their doubts, but they're not dogmatically holding to a belief system. Whereas he noticed that the atheists, in a lot of cases, including Alex O'Connor, has sort of a dogmatic hold on this idea that there is no God. He does not believe, and he apparently doesn't question whether or not what he does believe is true.
That means is that the inventions of religious morality are just those inventions, and inventions of a human mind. Now, if you have a human morality that recognizes that it is essentially a series of compromises between the history of mankind trying to get along with each other on a planet, then what happens is sometimes these ideas and these philosophies rub up against the real world, and we can adapt them as necessary. Now, there is a deep problem with this, and that is, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, or a friend, and he says that he doesn't believe in God, there's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction, I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral community, but there's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal reproach available to me, because there is no law written by any man of any time that could ever count one iota against the dictates of the creator of the universe. Therefore, if that God in fact does not exist, and if these moralities are in fact human inventions, then what you have in the grounding of an ethical system in the dictates, allegedly, of the creator of the universe is all of the arbitrariness and subjectivity and failure and faults of nihilism and human invented morality, with all of the certainty and all of the faith and all of the unanswerability of the creator of the universe. That to me seems a dangerous cocktail that we drink at our peril.
So many things there, and so much that you're saying is quite brilliant. I actually thought you were going in a different direction with that last example, which I'll explain in a second. So yeah, to start with the very beginning, obviously the idea of right and wrong. So there are many problems with emotivism. Alistair McIntyre does a good job sort of breaking down the problems with emotivism. But the sort of idea that there have to be certain moral absolutes that are beyond contention, and those moral absolutes have to be universally accepted. You can ground that, I suppose, in a sort of descriptive universe. The problem is that, to go back to your example, which again I think is a really interesting one, if a man comes to kill me, I think the real question of religion versus non-religion in the utility sphere here is it more likely that a man is going to come to kill you being a devotee of a religion that says that he must kill you? Or is it more likely that a man is going to kill you out of self-interest because he is not a devotee of a God who says that killing is wrong? So if you are faced with these two alternatives, to kind of remove your example one step, the question is why the man has come to kill you. I mean, that's your premise is the man has come to kill you because God told him to, and so he can't be dissuaded by force. Agreed. We see that full scale in the real world on a fairly regular basis. It is also true that over the course of human history, men have come to kill one another on the basis of self-interest in extraordinary amounts of the time. Tribal self-interest, particularly, having no particular relationship with God, just the idea that I want to kill you over territory, I want to kill you over resources, I want to kill you because you're not a member of my immediate kin family, or because you killed a member of my kin family, and so in revenge, I need to kill a member of your kin family. The entire, to borrow from your language, the entire sort of evolution of religion on a utility basis would have been to create moral absolutes that are applicable more broadly than to you and your friends. Any morality that can be created on an individual level is inherently dangerous because you can immediately graft that morality onto your personal self-interest. The entire purpose of religion, whether you want to ground that in evolutionary brain functionings, or whether you want to ground that in revelation, the entire purpose of religion on a utility level is to remove morality from the purview of my special interest and to say, here are things that I cannot do, even if they are in my interest, because there is a higher power that says I cannot do these things. I think that a society that does not have these moral absolutes is in deep trouble.
Just to comment on our moral absolutes in the Judeo-Christian belief system is we have the moral absolutes of do not murder. Okay, so do not murder, do not steal, do not covet your neighbor's wife, do not covet your neighbor's goods. We have quite a few commandments in the 10 Commandments. Now, Ben Shapiro believes that there are 613 commandments in the Orthodox Judaism beliefs that he holds. And so he believes there's a system of beliefs. Now, Jesus said that our commandments could be boiled down to two. love the Lord your God above all else, and love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, if you love your neighbor as yourself, you're not going to kill your neighbor. You're not going to steal from your neighbor. So we have a system that God has given us, and it's passed through the generations, and it's really helped society. The belief that we are made in God's image, or God's image bearers, that's really important. That speaks to quite a few things. In fact, it speaks to the fact that every single society in the world that Shalom Schwartz had surveyed. Shalom Schwartz is a professor out of Hebrew University, and he surveyed thousands of people on these 10 values that everybody shares. He said in every single country around the world, people had a moral ought. The highest moral ought was to be benevolent, to be kind to the in-group. That can be explained evolutionarily because in our evolution, we were kind to our in-groups. That's what helped us survive. But he's also said that the second and third ranked values in every society were, sometimes the second was universalism and the third was self-direction. Sometimes it was reversed. But either way, universalism was in the top 3. What is universalism? That is that we have this moral obligation to be good to others, to the outgroups, to plants, animals, things in the planet. We have a moral obligation to do that. Now, that cannot be explained evolutionarily. Okay, sending goods to people we don't know across the world because we want to help them, that can't be explained by trying to self-protect because we have a natural inclination to be selfish. And so there's those kind of arguments that help to support the fact that God has infused in us a conscience. And if we were just lucky beneficiaries of cosmic dust getting together, this would be just delusional for us to think that we have any sort of conscience or any sort of moral obligation. And so that's the problem with atheism. They believe that they're just lucky beneficiaries of cosmic random chances, that somehow they were able to evolve, and somehow they've developed a system of morals that expands across all countries of the world where people know their moral obligations. Whether or not they follow it, that's another issue. Some people don't follow it, but they know what they have. They know there's a moral obligation. They know there's an ought. That's been captured. It's not just captured there, though. The golden rule has been captured, according to another study, in the 7 major world religions. Okay, the idea of doing good unto others as you would have them do unto you. That also goes across populations. That is something that's helped to shape society. And Western society, as pointed out in this video, and also just pointed out by Tom Holland in his book Dominion, Western society has evolved from a place where people were really worshiping the leaders in the society. Many times they thought they were gods, going way back thousands of years. The leaders were being worshiped. They were treated differently. There was a different set of laws for them. Ben Shapiro here brings up the Code of Hammurabi, and he talks about how it varies from the Bible laws. The Bible laws talk a lot about the weak person. The meek will inherit the world. That is completely different than the way society was prior to the advent of Christianity when Jesus came to the earth. So let's keep going.
A society that refuses to say that there are certain absolutes that cannot be crossed under any circumstances that are universally applicable, it reduces things that we all take for granted, like equal justice before the law, like the idea that the law is supposed to equally apply to everybody, whether they're a member of your family or whether they're not. And there are broad cultural differences in these questions. I mean, to pretend that all human societies have equality under law is obviously not true. It's not even remotely true, actually. There's a very good book called The Weirdest People in the World, all about the idea that we in the West have this sort of ethnocentric view of ourselves where we think everybody thinks like people in the West. But the truth is that because we are Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, we have particular views of the world. Those views are drawn from a particularistic tradition. That particularistic tradition is biblical in nature. I mean, it is Judeo-Christian in nature, even if you're just describing.
He's totally right. Now, just to point out, just to highlight sort of something what he's saying, if you, again, you went back a couple thousand years and you went back prior to that and you looked at the way the societies were structured, if you were wealthy, healthy, and wise, a lot of times you were valued in society and you did not receive the same punishments for certain crimes as the poor person did. And many people viewed the poor, the impoverished, the people who were suffering, the people who had nothing. They thought that God loved them less and that therefore they deserved to be punished more for any crimes that they committed. So there was a different set of systems, a different set of laws in place in the past. Christianity turned that on its face and said, no, 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 all are created equal. And that has found, luckily for us, it's part of our founding fathers' Declaration of Independence, Constitution. It's found part of our laws, this idea that all men are created equal under the eyes of God, and that we're entitled to certain rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're all given that. And that's also part of the UN Declaration. And so when the UN Declaration also speaks to the intrinsic human value of life. So all humans have valuable lives. All humans matter, and it's something really important. And I think that's one thing that if we keep those principles intact, we don't let society tear those down through the chaos that we've seen enraging and engulfing our nations, I think that can make us better.
European society or American society, historically speaking. So the kind of removal of God from the equation, your suggestion is that God makes a person impervious to countervailing responses. And my answer is yes, God does make a person impervious to countervailing responses, including the evils of one's own heart, if you truly believe that God is standing above you, telling you not to do that thing. And again, social science tends to bear this out. People who believe that God is above them tend to give more charity, for example. People who tend to live inside religious communities, within the religious community. And I'm not going to pretend that I think all religions are equivalent in their truth propositions, because I don't. I mean, if I did, I wouldn't be wearing a yarmulke, right? So that's just what it is. Inside religious communities, a lot of social bonds and a lot of social frameworks are built on the basis of this shared belief system. In other words, diversity itself, self-interest, cannot always check self-interest, and it tends to tear apart societies and communities unless there is an orienting goal. That orienting goal traditionally has been performed by church. It's been traditionally performed by the idea that you are serving God together. And because of that, people build these social bonds, including the institutions of police, for example, to prevent people from killing each other, because we now all agree that killing is wrong. So we ought to have a third party that we can actually give the power to stop that killing. So again, I think that the question of the utility here is one of whether you think that the chief danger is that people are going to believe in a God who tells them to kill in God's name, or whether you think that the chief danger is in man's own heart, and that man is going to be driven by his own self-interest to commit murder and then call it something else.
I think it's all very.
I think there's a third point. So you have different motivations. The third part is he's not mentioning is the Judeo-Christian call from God, from the Judeo-Christian God, our Lord, that we are not to murder. Okay, so that's something that he has called on us not to do. He doesn't want us murdering our children within us. He doesn't want us murdering the elderly, doing euthanasia. He doesn't endorse suicide, all that kind of stuff. We are not the ones who are in charge of our souls. God is in charge of our soul. So that's one thing. The other thing is the influence of the Judeo-Christian value system on a person would mean that you inside know through God that you are not to be going around killing. Okay, you're not to go around murdering innocent people. You're not supposed to murder the baby inside of you. You're not supposed to do any of that kind of stuff. That's very important. The other thing that I just want to highlight here is two distinctions. One is the extrinsically religious and the intrinsically religious. I think what Ben is kind of tapping on a little bit there are the extrinsically religious. So people who are motivated by the extrinsic benefits of religion. For example, the community. The fact that you go to church and you're in a big group and you have a cloud of witnesses around you. You've got all of that stuff in the church. This morning I was at the Catholic Church. We did the RCIA initiation of rites. I was sponsoring a girl. It was a wonderful experience. Just seeing everyone come up to her at the end and congratulate her and just tell her they were so happy for her and welcome to the community. That is a fantastic part of the church. But the part that really helps health outcomes, things like anxiety and depression and all of those kind of issues, what really helps that is when you have high levels of intrinsic religiosity, meaning that you're going to church not just because of the community and the externals. You're there because of the internal, your heart, your relationship with God. You're building up a relationship with Jesus Christ. And through that experience, you're really making yourself, it really brings you a lot of joy. Now, as Mother Mary said to Bernadette, the woman at Lourdes, she said, I might not be able to bring you happiness in this earth. And of course, Bernadette suffered quite a bit, but I will give you joy in the next. And what C.S. Lewis and others have pointed out is that every so often God gives us those little glimpses of joy in this world. And so, and inner peace. And that's even probably something that it was funny because in confession yesterday, I mentioned to the priest, I said, sometimes I lose my patience with my sons. And so, and I need more patience. And he said, well, you just really have to exercise that system of inner peace. And the church brings you that. So it's the intrinsic stuff oftentimes that are beneficial. But let's listen to Alex's answer here.
Well and good when this religious tradition is protecting what you think is good. But as we know, it can do the exact opposite, and it can do so with the same force.
Sure.
And I suppose the question we have to ask is whether this is a worthwhile trade-off. That is to say, you know, that there may be some social utility in putting our fundamental ethical assumptions outside of the realm of debate. But when those ethical statements begin to inspire what we would probably consider to be less than socially cohesive behavior, there is nothing you can do, nothing to talk people out of them, precisely because that's where they've placed them. And that seems dangerous to me. And it seems, for example, you know, a lot of people talk about how religion can make people happier. It can make people more socially cohesive. It can promote people to start families and have children. This is true of most religions. This is also true of Islam, which I'm not sure you would want to say. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm not sure you'd want to say as a force for good in the world. I don't think, in other words, that it's always a worthwhile trade-off. Now,
I agree with you, by the way.
Just because you mentioned how the sort of culture of Europe and its success and America is indebted to Christianity. I mean, this is of course true in a sense, but there's been a recent revival, it seems. I don't really know quite how it's happened. I think it's got a lot to do with Tom Holland, maybe. That's the historian.
Yeah, and he's right. I just mentioned Tom Holland's book a little while ago, but I want to point out also the idea that Catholics, a lot of times Catholics encourage the community, the people to go and have lots of kids. In Catholicism, they don't believe that in contraception. They believe that contraception is morally wrong. And because they want you to have as many kids as God wants you to have, as God has blessed you with. And so that's something in Catholicism. I don't know the Muslim beliefs or other beliefs around the world, but I do know that Muslims are encouraged to have big families, and many of them do. And so those are two things coming out of those beliefs. I'm not sure whether or not Jewish people encourage a lot of kids in their families. The Jewish people I know, and I've known quite a few because I lived in Boca Raton for 21 years. The Jewish people I know had smaller families, actually. But of course, I have a small family, relatively speaking. I only have 2 sons. And so it's a relatively small family, husband, wife, 2 sons. But I would have liked to have a lot more. I would have definitely liked that. That would have been quite nice. So anyway, so that's something that you definitely see in religion. But the idea also, as far as European, and it's sort of on the fumes of Judeo-Christian values, I think that Judeo-Christian values built Europe into what it is. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't appreciate that. It sounds like Alex might not appreciate that as much. And it's something that I think you might start to appreciate, and perhaps that is what's leading to the revival. Just to give a quick summary of Tom Holland's book, he pointed to all of the institutions, the Western institutions, universities, hospitals, charitable institutions. He pointed to all of that, and he sourced it in Christianity. And he talked about the very beginning, like way back when the crucifixion was a very egregious but very popular means of torture and execution in the Roman Empire. They were doing all kinds of mean things. They would go to the stadium to watch people be mauled by animals, the Colosseum. They would cheer that stuff. They would leave their little women, their unwanted female babies, to rot in the streets. That's what they would do. They would expose them. That's what they called it, exposing them. And he pointed out the way that a lot of the Christians were scooping up these kids, scooping up the orphans, and helping people through hospitals. In the old days, he pointed out that the hospitals were really just for the Roman soldiers and other valuable people in society, or considered valuable. But through Christianity, everyone suddenly now has value. We all have equal value in the eyes of the Lord. And that's also has Jewish roots. So that same idea led to the structure of a lot of hospitals that could serve multiple populations, including the poor and people without any money to fund themselves. And so that came from that. And so Christian values have been infused, and a lot of people don't really appreciate that. The other thing is the value of the individual and individualism. That is important too, meaning that you have individual rights, we have property rights. That's not something you get in communist societies. One of the things in communism is they believe that the collective should work for the common good. And the common good is really the people sitting on top who are stealing from everybody else and filling up their own bank accounts. But I digress. Here we go.
Not the superhero.
Not Spider-Man.
This idea that
Although
actually
he's good too.
Actually, the great. I wonder what he would have to say on all of this. The Western civilization sort of depends and should be in gratitude to to a religious tradition because it provided this kind of ethical framework in which this could have arisen. We hear about the scientific enlightenment. We hear about, you know, the grounding of ethics and God, the creation of natural rights, as if these things weren't established in resistance all the way along to the religious tradition. A society that today, I'll expand on this if you like, a society today that decides that religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about the age of both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the common evolutionary ancestry of every animal, including the human animal.
You know, the interesting thing is this is a terrible straw man, and it's really unfortunate. One of the things that Alex does throughout this debate is he tries to pick on biblical passages. He goes to slavery in the Old Testament and things like that. And he's kind of like the 12-year-old atheist who just learned a couple little nuggets about Christianity or a couple little nuggets about Judaism, and he groups everyone together. Now, in the Catholicism, the Pope actually hasn't said anything negative about evolutionary biology, and he hasn't said that that's not something that Catholics can believe. In fact, he said that's something Catholics can believe. And so had he done a little homework, he would have seen that. Catholics, and the reason this is important is because Catholics make up the majority of all Christians. There are more Catholics on the planet than any other Christian denomination by far. So it's important to see exactly what we believe. Now, as far as women and being a woman, I can see what people a lot of times will look down at the church and say, well, then how come men are running the church? Why are the men the people in charge? The priests are men. Why is that? Well, it's because Jesus did create a structure. He said men and women are equal. He equally loved us. He even gave women the very beautiful benefit of being the first to discover his empty tomb. He gave that beautiful belief, the best thing that ever happened in the Bible. He gave that opportunity to a woman, Mary Magdalene. He gave his mother, the first person to learn about him coming to the earth through the angel Gabriel. His mother was given that piece of information. She was first to learn that. So he exalted women in a way that was not something done in the past. He also was helping a woman who had committed adultery. When no one was around to judge her after he had them walk away, he helped her out. He basically said, go sin no more. And so he was very good to women in the Old Testament. But he also has a structure. So we each have a role, and the role goes from Jesus to the male in the church, the senior male, he's the priest, to the women. And it's just like it goes to Jesus, to the husband, then to the wife. That's the structure he set up. We're equal, but we have different roles, and I have no problem with that. Another thing that he mentions here is slavery. A little later, he'll mention slavery, and he is talking about the fact that there was slavery in the Old Testament and that God gave rules on how people should treat their slaves, and how God didn't tell people they had to abolish the slave trade. Well, back in those times, the slavery was ubiquitous. It wasn't exactly the type of slavery that we saw in the antebellum period in the United States. It was a much different type, where slaves could, if they were run away and be, say, captured, if they felt like they were being so mistreated that they ran away and they were captured, they were told to be treated very well by the people who captured them. And they didn't return them back to their owners. And the owners were more like, they were really like servants and indentured servitudes. That sort of a slave relationship. And many cases were temporary and all that kind of stuff, and were done when people decided they wanted to do that. But I'm digressing. I'm going past what he also said. He also has this early earth, this young earth thing. The Catholics are not people who are young earth creationists. That's not something that the Catholics believe. We just follow what the Bible says, and Thomas Aquinas and others have also drawn conclusions about the earth that I think are much more reasonable. And so had he looked into that, he would have seen the Catholic beliefs. Not that he would do that because he's going to look at Jewish beliefs, but from what I understand about Judaism, they don't endorse a young earth. So he's picked on a very small minority of Christians to try to say that we all endorse these things. We all thought that the world was revolving, the sun was revolving around the world. Yeah, sometimes the science is catching up, but it doesn't go against anything in the Bible. If you haven't heard my discussions, and I've had many with Hugh Ross on my channel, Hugh Ross has gone back to the book of Genesis. He is an astrophysicist, and he's mapped out the way that the earth was formed against the science. And he says the Bible is the only religious text that is completely consistent. And so if you really want to know what another religion thinks, it's important to maybe ask people in those other religions before strawmanning and misrepresenting them. I want to say that for one. Ben Shapiro did say that. He said, I don't try to go into other people's religious texts and judge them. And I also don't do that. Like, I don't go into the Muslim texts, the Quran. I don't do that to judge the Muslims because I know so little about it, but also because I don't want to misrepresent the Muslims. Same thing if I went into the Hindu text, I don't do that. I don't bother because I don't want to go and misrepresent the Hindus for what they believe. And so you'll see me rarely talk about those beliefs. But anyway, here we go.
On planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property, now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things. As I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that the Earth might orbit the sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution, which he authored, was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I'd find it funny.
I have to say, as soon as you hear Ben's response here, hold on for that because you're going to want to hear this. His response is excellent, and that's one of the reasons why I'm focusing on this part of the debate.
If it wasn't so offensive to the people who established these very developments against the very religious traditions that now want to claim them as their own.
Okay, so I would buy that, except for the fact that many of the people that you mentioned in these contexts explicitly counted themselves as religious believers and were speaking in the name of the religion while they were doing it. So to take the abolitionist movement as an example, I mean, William Wilberforce, obviously a tremendously religious person and a big believer in the New Testament. Isaac Newton, obviously deeply ensconced in the New Testament, right? Yeah, certainly important to the scientific revolution. The point about religion, and this is why when I wrote my book, what I have to name the title now and plug myself because that's the way it works.
To wave around
the right side of history. The reason that I talked about how reason and moral purpose made the West is because I think that one of the fundamental precepts of at least Judeo-Christian religion is that when God gives a text or a set of ideas to human beings, he expects us to use our reason to apply to those texts. And so the sort of evolution of interpretation is part of the religious tradition. I mean, that's always been the case in my religion anyway. So I always hesitate to speak on behalf of other people's religions because I don't know them nearly as well as I know my own. So when I talk about sort of the application of reason to tradition in the religious tradition, obviously we have books and books and books of texts discussing and debating these very ideas. And the idea of religious debate has always been central to the idea of Judeo-Christian religion. And when it hasn't been, it's been seen as repressive and has spawned then other Christian movements that then argue with the original movement and end up generating in almost Hegelian fashion some new form of interpretation. The point that I'm making is that outside that framework, it doesn't exist. Meaning that once if the argument is over interpretation of particular biblical verses in a context in which there is a God who puts certain moral precepts beyond human judgment, those arguments you can have without threatening the entire social structure. What is very difficult is to have a social structure at all in the absence of fundamental moral precepts that are presupposed by everyone. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing a sort of revival of this idea that religion is very important to the West is because one of the things that we have seen is that as religion has become less important to the West, we've seen declining birth rates en masse. We've seen rises in suicidal ideation. We've seen, especially over the last 10 years, tremendous individual atomization, certainly an extraordinary amount of less social connection, right? All of these things are things that frankly used to be provided by church and these social institutions that again were oriented toward a single purpose. So when you talk about the idea that I'm going to put aside the free will discussion because I think again it's easy to get caught up in the reversion to the argument that I was making before when you were saying that can you argue the man out of stabbing you? To use your framework, I mean you can't argue him out of doing anything. I mean you're going to say words, the words are going to have an impact, but you can't argue him out of doing anything. But not to get back into a topic that we've handled. Free will is done.
I'm not gonna answer that, although hopefully people will know from what I said before that I think it's still sensible to say you can argue somebody out of something. The first half of what you say there is in so many words, I think, what I was saying before, which is that, yes, this goes both ways. That is, thanks be to God when he is able to provide us with the grounding for resisting oppression and throwing off tyranny. Yeah. But what about when the same God is used to justify the exact opposite? All I'm saying is that this goes both ways. We'll never know.
But you're going to have to weigh in one side or the other, meaning that in terms of utility, right? You're building a society. Let's say that I won't say you're God. Let's say that you are master of a society and you get to build that society. One of the things that presumably you are going to do is you're going to build in certain things that are untouchable, right?
So, and what the Christian God has done he's built in things such as the truth. In fact, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So we have some basic foundational moral obligations. One of the moral obligations is to be truthful, seek the truth, tell the truth. It's very important to be loving, to be kind, to be just, to be fair. We have all of this kind of stuff. Now, Alex and a lot of other people who decided that they don't want to be Christians, or they don't agree with Christians or the Jews, or they don't agree with religious faith just more generally, a lot of times they'll pick on something that they disagree with in the Bible with related to certain sexual sins. So there are certain sexual sins in the Bible with which they don't agree. And so they decided that they're going to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. Therefore, God can't be true because they disagree with how God said that homosexuals are doing something that goes against what he has set up. He set up a structure for a one man, one woman to get together and bear children. That's the structure he's put in place. That's the one he endorses. He does not endorse these other sorts of relationships. He wouldn't be in the business of marrying people into of the same sex, or multiple people into a marriage, say more than two people. That's not something that God endorses. Jesus came and he explained that quite clearly in the Gospels. You can see where he explained exactly the sort of structure that God wanted. And so because Alex and others disagree with that, and I've seen some pretty nice people walk away from Christianity, like Kevin, the non-traditional Catholic. I've seen them walk away purely because of their disagreement about the homosexuality issue. And I think that's very sad. It's like, okay, I disagree with this one little part of the Bible, therefore I'm going to throw the whole baby out of the bathwater. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's crazy. And so, and the other things, a lot of them are straw men based on ancient cultures. So you say, okay, well, the ancient culture, people did this. Like in the ancient culture, actually people did marry more women. King Solomon had hundreds of women who were his wives. And so obviously in the ancient culture, it was operating different ways than we see culture today. Does that mean that God endorsed those marriages in the ancient cultures? Well, it means that God had a different lens looking at the ancient cultures. But when Jesus came, he clarified how we were to treat each other. He also clarified dietary differences and other differences. So if you go to Acts 10, for example, you're going to see that suddenly we can eat pork and we can eat shellfish and we can mix ham and cheese. We can do all that kind of stuff if we want to, because God said everything is clean in Acts 10. The new covenant is a little bit different. So when people go in and they start dragging around, as Alex did later in this debate, he starts dragging around the Old Testament and saying, oh, well, God did this, God did that, spells out the whole thing with slaves, and ignores the fact that, number one, the West has been able to get rid of the whole slave trade. We've been able to get rid of the slave trade. And Christians were the ones who were behind that. So as we've evolved and realized some of the principles in the Bible, we realize some of the evils in our society. That's how it works. And that's a pretty good thing. And the other thing that I would just point out, as far as pointing out the old stuff, is that people in the Old Testament were under the Mosaic covenant. We're under the new covenant. Okay, Jesus came and he completed the Mosaic covenant and gave us this new covenant. And under the new covenant, we've basically got a couple of really important calls. Love the Lord above all else and love your neighbors as yourself. And you can play that out in every single way. And that's what's built Western society into such a great society that is today. So I want to say thank you to any of you who came in here. I see Captive Desk is there. He says, a person is not truth. Yes, Jesus is the truth. He's the truth. He's the way, the truth, and the life. And the best thing that you can do is seek the truth. In fact, just to throw a little padding on this, I've watched quite a few videos on near-death experiences. And sometimes I'm kind of questioning the person who's giving whatever they're saying. I might be saying, no way, this isn't something that's possible. Other times, some of these near-death experiences have a little nugget of truth in them. And I think that one of the things that has a nugget of truth is a couple of the experiences I saw where people were somehow in hell. And when they were in hell, the way that they broke free in two of the cases that I saw, one was Howard Storm and another one was a woman, and I forget her name. But in both of the cases, in his case, he started calling out for Jesus. And he hadn't really fully died yet. He was having a near-death experience. He was on an operating table. The same thing with the woman. She was in this awful place. She suddenly started kind of realizing she's in hell. And as she's in there, she starts singing. The demons tell her, oh, it's Christmas on earth. It's the worst time to be in hell. And so she starts singing her favorite Christian songs, Away in a Manger, and suddenly finds herself in all the light. She's surrounded by the light. She's in a much more beautiful place. It was peaceful and all that kind of good stuff. And so the bottom line is, any of you atheists who are watching this, if you do find yourself in the afterlife in a really awful place, and maybe you're still sitting on an operating table somewhere where you can be resuscitated, call out to Jesus. Maybe you'll be resuscitated in near-death experience, and you'll be back with another opportunity and another chance. Just remember that. So thank you, everybody, for coming in. Oliver Catwell, hallelujah, Captive Desk. Great to see all of you. I hope you guys have a great day. If you like this kind of content, please like, subscribe, and remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Thank you.